He inherited an abandoned store, but his cousin got the fortune months later. After years behind bars, Marcus is free, but the world outside holds a far greater challenge than he could have imagined. With a mysterious inheritance in hand, a rundown old store and a rusty car, he must decide, give up or fight for a new life. The metallic sound of the prison door closing behind Marcus echoed in his ears like the definitive end of a dark chapter in his life. He took a deep breath of the cold morning air, feeling the wind on his face for the first time in years. The rising sun painted the horizon in shades of orange, but even the soft light couldn't warm the ice that had formed in his chest. He was free, yes, but freedom had a bitter taste. The world outside was a battlefield, and he knew it wouldn't be easy to start over. His past followed him like a shadow. Standing there in front of the gate, he looked at his hands. The scars, both physical and emotional, were constant reminders of who he had been and all he had lost. 2 years in prison. 2 years away from a life that no longer existed. The only person who visited him regularly was his mother, but even she had distanced herself in recent months, perhaps tired of the shame and hurt he had caused. Marcus grabbed the small backpack he had with him, containing his few belongings: a wallet, some papers, and a letter from his late father's lawyer. That letter was his only connection to an uncertain future. His father, who had died while he was still in prison, left him an inheritance. If only there had been time to reconcile, he thought, feeling a pang of regret. He walked to the bus stop, his hands trembling as he touched the coins in his pocket, paid the fare, and sat in one of the back seats, trying to go unnoticed. The people around him didn't pay him any attention, but Marcus felt the weight of judgment, as if his mistakes were written on his face. What he wouldn't give to turn back time, to undo the mistakes that had brought him here. But that wasn't an option. Now all that remained was to try to rebuild, or at least pretend he could. Arriving at his father's lawyer's office, Marcus felt the discomfort of being in an environment that exuded wealth and power. The walls were lined with dark wood, and the leather chairs reflected the soft light streaming in through the large windows. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with perfectly groomed gray hair, greeted him with an impassive look. He seemed accustomed to dealing with delicate situations, but Marcus knew what was about to come would be especially painful. "Marcus, please, have a seat," said the lawyer, gesturing toward a chair in front of his desk. He showed neither sympathy nor judgment, but there was something distant in his eyes. "Thank you," Marcus mumbled, sitting down. His hands were sweating, and he wiped his palm across his forehead, trying to control his growing anxiety. The lawyer opened a file of documents with meticulous precision. Every movement was calm, almost calculated, which only heightened the tension in the room. Finally, he picked up an envelope, opened it, and began to read. "Your father's will was clear. He left the inheritance divided between you and your cousin David." The mention of David's name made Marcus clench his teeth. David, the perfect boy, always the family's favorite, the son his father probably always wished Marcus had been. "David," Marcus repeated, his voice dry. He had hoped his father had given him a second chance, some opportunity to start over, to prove he wasn't a total failure. "And what exactly did my father leave me?" The lawyer adjusted his glasses and continued, impassively. "He left all the financial assets, investments, and liquid assets to David. For you, he left a property in the countryside, an old family store, and a car that is in the garage of the property." Marcus blinked, trying to process the words. A store? In the countryside? That wasn't what he expected. He had hoped for some money, something that could help him clear his name and maybe start a new life. But an old store? What was he supposed to do with that? "That's everything?" he asked, his voice faltering as his mind tried to make sense of it. "That's everything," confirmed the lawyer, without a trace of empathy. He pushed a folder of documents toward Marcus. "These are the property papers. Everything is in your name now." For a moment, Marcus didn't know what to say. He felt a lump form in his throat, as if the weight of the expectations he had placed on that inheritance was crumbling in his hands. He had hoped that despite everything, his father would see him as worthy of something more. Something that could help him climb out of the hole he was in. Instead, his father had left him with just an old store in a town he barely knew. "Your father was a shrewd businessman," The lawyer continued, interrupting Marcus's thoughts. He always believed in the value of hard work. I believe he left this property to you as a symbol of that. Marcus clutched the documents in his hands, trying to control the storm of emotions within him. Hard work, all he had done so far was fight against the system, against his past, against himself. And now his father was handing him a challenge, while David got everything that mattered. He stood up slowly, feeling the lawyer's gaze on him. "Thank you," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He took the folder and left the office. Outside, the biting cold of the morning felt even more intense. The wind whistled in his ears as he walked aimlessly through the city streets. He felt betrayed, abandoned by someone who, even after death, still didn't see him as deserving of a real chance. David got everything, and he was left with an old store and an ancient car. As he walked, his father's words echoed in his mind. Hard work, maybe there was some sense in what he couldn't yet see. Maybe that store was his last chance to start over. But at the moment, all he felt was the pain of being overlooked again. The journey to the small countryside town seemed endless. The bus rattled on the dirt roads, kicking up dust, and Marcus watched the landscape through the window. Vast dry fields, rusty fences, and scattered houses worn by time. There was something melancholic about these scenes, as if they reflected the state he himself was in. Every mile took him further from the big city, the people, the noise. And the closer he got to his destination, the more distant his old life felt. Sitting in the uncomfortable bus seat, Marcus remembered the last time he had seen his father. They barely spoke. Their relationship had deteriorated long before his imprisonment. His father never forgave him for taking a different path, for not embracing the family legacy. "You'll end up destroying everything," he had once said during a bitter argument. And now, ironically, it was Marcus who was supposed to rebuild something from what was left. As the bus rounded a sharp curve, a fleeting memory of his childhood surfaced in his mind. He and his father, together in the store, which was bustling and full of customers at the time. The smell of new wood, the lively conversation with suppliers, their laughter as they arranged the shelves. For a moment, a wave of nostalgia washed over Marcus, but it was quickly replaced by the harsh reality. That life was in the past, and all that remained now was the distant echo of what could have been. When the bus finally stopped at the small town station, Marcus got off with his backpack slung over his shoulder. He looked around, feeling like a stranger in unfamiliar territory. The town was modest, with cobblestone streets, some old houses with faded facades, and small shops. The commercial center, if it could be called that, consisted of half a dozen low-rise buildings that formed a main street, where the locals seemed to live at a pace that sharply contrasted with the hustle and bustle he knew from the big city. The silence was almost unsettling, broken only by the occasional sound of a passing car or distant voices. He walked slowly down the street, following the lawyer's directions until he arrived at the store he had inherited. When he finally saw it, his heart sank. The building stood before him, but what he found was a desolate sight. The facade was covered in dust and grime, the windows opaque, and the store sign hung crookedly, so worn that it was barely legible. The doors, made of old wood, creaked at the slightest touch. Marcus paused for a moment, contemplating the place that was now his. He felt a mix of anger and sadness. Was this his father's legacy? An abandoned store that hadn't seen a customer in years? He turned the key he had received from the lawyer and entered. The smell of mold and old would hit him immediately, like a punch to the gut. The shelves were collapsed, covered in dust. The floor, dirty and cracked, seemed forgotten for decades. It was as if time had stood still inside, frozen the moment the last person left and closed the doors. "What the hell?" Marcus muttered to himself as he slowly walked through the dark interior. In the silence, his footsteps echoed, and he felt more alone than ever. The store was larger than he had imagined, but in such a deplorable state that he didn't know where to start. Did his father really believe he could do something with this? Did he see him as someone capable of reviving such a place? Near the back of the store, he spotted a door. Curious, he pushed it open, revealing a small garage. Sunlight filtered through the dirty window and illuminated a car covered by a dusty tarp. The lawyer had mentioned something about an old car, but Marcus hadn't paid much attention. Now there it was, hidden like a forgotten memory. He approached and pulled off the tarp, revealing a classic car, an old model that he immediately recognized. His father had loved cars, and this was one of his favorites. Though covered in dust and visibly neglected, Marcus knew that with the right restoration, that car could be worth a good sum. For a moment, he stood there, looking at the car, lost in thought. Maybe, just maybe, this was a sign that there was still something to be salvaged. Maybe this store and that car were more than just an inheritance. Maybe they were an opportunity, a chance to prove to himself that he could build something, just as his father had done decades ago. He sighed and ran his hand over the car's hood, feeling the rough surface under his fingers. "So, Dad, is this what you wanted?" he asked aloud, as if expecting his father's spirit to be there, listening. "Did you leave this for me because you knew I could fix it? Or was this just another cruel joke?" The silence was his only response. But in that silence, something changed inside Marcus. The anger began to dissipate, and in its place, a quiet determination started to grow. If his father believed he could start over with this, then he would try. He would sell the car, use the money to renovate the store, and see what could come of it. It was his only chance, and he couldn't afford to fail. The car sold faster than Marcus had imagined. He had taken a few pictures of the vehicle, even covered in dust, and posted them online on classic car collector forums. Offers started coming in almost immediately. The classic model attracted a lot of attention, and within a few days, Marcus had struck a deal with a collector who was willing to pay a considerable amount for the car. He felt a mixture of relief and concern. On one hand, the money he would receive was more than enough to begin the store's renovation. On the other, he knew the renovation process wouldn't be easy. The structure was old, and the place needed much more than a fresh coat of paint to become viable again. With the money from the car sale in hand, Marcus hired a small team of local workers. They arrived early the next morning, carrying tools and construction materials. Marcus stood in front of the store, watching as the men unloaded wooden boards, cans of paint, and other tools needed for the renovation. He still wasn't sure how he would transform the place, but he knew that if he wanted to start over, he needed to be involved in every step. "It's going to take a lot of work, but I think we can fix it up," said one of the workers, a robust middle-aged man, as he assessed the store's walls. Marcus nodded. He had spent the previous night lying on the old mattress he had placed in the back of the store, thinking about how surreal everything seemed. The store was now his temporary home, and every corner of it reflected his current situation, run down, but full of potential. In the first few days, the repairs were grueling. The crew began by dismantling the old shelves, fixing the leaky roof, and removing the cracked floor. Marcus, who had never worked on a renovation before, watched every detail closely. He didn't have the experience the workers had, but he was determined to learn. He watched intently as each wall was repainted, as old materials were replaced with new ones. With every hammer strike, with every nail driven in, he felt as if he were laying bricks in his own life, rebuilding himself from the ruins. Days turned into weeks, and the store began to take shape. What had once been a decaying, forgotten space now gained new life. The walls, once dirty and cracked, were painted white, bringing a sense of freshness to the environment. New shelves were installed, and the floor was covered with new wood. The store was being reborn just like Marcus. Despite the visible progress, Marcus still felt insecure. He spent hours thinking about what he would do with the store once the renovation was finished. What kind of products would he sell? How would he attract customers in such a small town? Sitting on one of the new wooden chairs he had ordered for the future cafe, he looked at the empty space before him, lost in thought. One afternoon, while the crew was putting the finishing touches on the trim, Marcus decided to go out and walk around the town. He needed inspiration, needed to better understand the people who lived there. As he strolled through the quiet streets, he observed the other stores and the daily routine of the residents. It was a simple community, made up of people who seemed to value what was authentic and handmade. That's when an idea began to form in his mind. He would go back to his roots. The store would sell handcrafted products, items made by local artisans. It would be a place that reflected the simplicity and warmth of that town. Additionally, The small cafe he envisioned could become a gathering place for the locals, a space where people could share their stories, just as he would share his new life. That night, Marcus finally felt like he had found a direction. He would sell not only products but also a new way of life. The store would be a reflection of his own rebirth, and the cafe would be the heart of that place. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He knew the hard work was just beginning, but he also knew he was on the right path. The months that followed were a true test for Marcus, but also a time of transformation. The store was almost unrecognizable compared to what he had found when he first arrived. The cafe, which he initially imagined as a small space, had become the heart of the store. People came not only to buy the artisanal products carefully chosen by Marcus, but also to spend hours chatting, drinking fresh coffee, and connecting with the community. The store, now called Roots, had special meaning for Marcus. It wasn't just a place of work, it was the symbol of his rebirth. Amidst all of this, Marcus hardly had time to think about the past. His days started early, preparing orders, organizing shelves, and welcoming the day's first customers. Every detail was carefully considered, and he made sure to keep the atmosphere cozy, so people would feel at home. The cafe, with its rustic wooden tables and comfortable chairs, was where he spent most of his time, serving customers, talking with them, and getting to know their stories. One afternoon, while reviewing the stock in the small office at the back of the store, Marcus heard a knock on the door. One of his employees, a young man who had worked with him since the renovation, opened the door timidly. "Marcus, there's someone here to see you," the young man said, looking a little unsettled. "Who is it?" Marcus asked without looking up from the papers. "I don't know. He didn't say his name, but I think you'll want to see him." The young man's tone was almost enigmatic. Marcus frowned, intrigued, and got up. As he stepped out of the office and walked toward the main area of the store, his heart raced when he saw who was standing there near the door. David, his cousin. The man who had inherited everything Marcus had hoped would help him start over. The same cousin who had never reached out to him since he had been released from prison, who had never offered him a helping hand, even knowing the situation Marcus was in. Marcus's blood ran cold. What was David doing there? David, on the other hand, looked like a completely different man from the one Marcus remembered. His face was gaunt and tired, his appearance disheveled. The expensive clothes he used to wear had been replaced by something simple, almost shabby. He was unrecognizable, as if life had stripped him of everything he possessed. "David," Marcus said, surprised, but without showing any emotion. The name left his mouth with a mixture of incredulity and distrust. David lowered his head for a moment, visibly ashamed, before speaking. "Marcus, I don't even know where to begin," he said, his voice trembling. "But I need help." Confusion took over Marcus. He crossed his arms, trying to understand what was happening. David, needing help? It was surreal. All his life, David had been the perfect son, the family's golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. And now here he was asking for help. "Help," Marcus repeated, still not believing what he was hearing. "What happened to you?" David took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice heavy with shame. "I lost everything, Marcus," he confessed. "All the money, the properties. I made terrible investments, trusted the wrong people. Now I have nothing left, not even a place to stay." For a moment, Marcus remained silent, trying to process the information. It was almost unbelievable. David, the man who had inherited their father's fortune, the cousin who had always looked down on Marcus, was now in the same position Marcus had been months ago, or perhaps even worse. "And what do you want from me?" Marcus asked with a tone that mixed curiosity and skepticism. "Why did you come here, David?" David lifted his eyes, and Marcus saw something in his cousin he had never seen before: desperation. Tears began to form in David's eyes, and his voice broke. "I don't have anyone else, Marcus. I know I treated you badly, ignored you. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but can you give me a chance? A job, maybe. Anything. I just need a chance to start over." The silence that followed was thick, heavy. Marcus stared at David for a long time, while a storm of conflicting emotions swirled inside him. Part of him wanted to say no, to remind David of all the times he had been ignored, looked down on. He wanted to make it clear that he was no longer the failed cousin. But at the same time, Marcus knew what it was like to hit rock bottom. He knew what it was like to have no one. He knew how desperate it felt. "I'll help you, David," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "But it won't be easy. You'll have to work hard. And this place," he gestured around the store, "isn't a life of luxury. If you really want a second chance, I'll give it to you, but you'll need to be willing to start from scratch. Just like I did." David nodded vigorously, tears finally streaming down his face. "I'll do whatever it takes, Marcus. Promise." Marcus sighed, still unsure of what he was doing, but something inside him told him it was the right thing. "There's a room in the back. It's small, but you can stay there until you get back on your feet. Start tomorrow. We've got a lot of work to do." David smiled, a weak but genuine smile. "Thank you, Marcus. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me now. Just do your job." With that, Marcus turned and went back to the office, still trying to process what had just happened. The cousin who once looked down on him was now under his care. Life indeed had its strange ways of turning things around. The days that followed brought a new dynamic for Marcus and David. The cousin, now working in the store, was a different man from the one Marcus had known. The arrogance that had always defined his personality was gone, replaced by a humility Marcus had never imagined. David arrived early every day, helping to organize the shelves, attending to customers, and doing whatever was needed to keep the business running. He seemed determined to redeem himself, but Marcus still kept a certain distance. "So, how's the work going?" Marcus asked one morning as they organized a new shipment of products. David, who was crouched in front of a shelf, looked up, surprised by the question. "It's going well, I think." "I'm still learning," David replied, a little hesitantly. He always seemed nervous when talking to Marcus, as if he was constantly waiting to be reprimanded. "You don't need to be afraid of making mistakes, David. Everyone makes mistakes." "I've made plenty myself," Marcus said, his voice softer than usual. He knew he still harbored some resentment from the past, but he also knew that if he wanted to move forward, he would need to let that go. David nodded and returned to work. The two cousins still didn't have an easy relationship. The past between them wasn't something that could be resolved overnight, but slowly the walls began to come down. In the weeks that followed, they started talking more, reminiscing about childhood moments before the family disputes and comparisons had driven them apart. "Do you remember that time we went fishing with Grandpa?" David asked one day while adjusting some boxes in the stockroom. Marcus chuckled softly. "How could I forget? You fell into the river and screamed like crazy. I think that was the only time I saw Grandpa laugh so much." David smiled, a sad smile. "He always liked you more, you know?" Marcus paused for a moment, surprised by the statement. "No, I never thought of it that way. I always thought you were the family's favorite." David shook his head. "I always thought you had more courage. You were always more authentic, you know? I was always trying to be what everyone else wanted me to be. And look where that got me." The silence that followed was loaded with meaning. Marcus knew what it was like to live under others' expectations, but he also knew what it was like to fail to meet them. They weren't as different as they thought. "Well, it doesn't matter anymore what happened. What matters is what we do from here on out, right?" Marcus said, finally breaking the silence. David nodded, his expression lighter than before. Slowly, the bonds that had been broken were being restored, not with grand gestures, but with small moments of reconciliation. Months had passed since David began working at the store, and he had gradually become an essential part of the business. The cousin that Marcus had once despised for his arrogance had transformed into someone humble, hardworking, and dedicated. He had proven to be a diligent learner, always willing to help and go above and beyond what was required. More than that, David seemed genuinely grateful for the opportunity he had been given. One quiet afternoon, while Marcus was reviewing the store's finances, David walked into the office with a serious expression. "Marcus, can we talk?" he asked, his voice carrying an unusual gravity. "Sure. What's up?" Marcus looked up from the papers and noticed the tension on his cousin's face. David took a deep breath as if gathering the courage to speak. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about how I acted in the past. And I wanted to apologize. Sincerely. He paused for a moment, and Marcus could see the genuine regret in his eyes. I know I treated you badly, that I was selfish and arrogant. I know that when you needed me the most, I turned my back on you. And I don't know if you can forgive me for that. The silence that followed was heavy, but different from before. Marcus knew this moment would come, and, to his surprise, he already had the answer. David, I forgive you, he said calmly. It's in the past. What matters is what we do from here on out, like I told you before. David nodded, visibly relieved. Marcus knew the apology hadn't been easy, but the gesture meant a lot. Thank you, Marcus. I'll never forget this, David said, his voice thick with emotion. That afternoon, the two cousins sat together on the small porch behind the store, watching the quiet movement of the town. The sun was setting, casting shades of orange and pink across the sky. It was a moment of peace, and Marcus felt that, finally, everything was in its place. You've done a great job here, Marcus, David said, breaking the silence. My father would be proud of you. Marcus smiled, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. His father, the man who had left him to face this challenge. Perhaps, deep down, he knew Marcus would be capable. Not with wealth or ease, but with effort and determination. And now, looking at everything he had built, Marcus felt that he had finally honored his family's legacy. I think he would be, Marcus replied. But, more importantly, I'm finally proud of myself. The sun set, and that night, the two cousins knew that together, they had found not just forgiveness, but redemption. Both had started over, not from riches, but from something far more valuable, the chance to become better men.